And so today we're going to be talking about the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. It is a book that's coming out, and it is a resource that I think you're going to find very helpful if you have individuals who either are atheist and maybe have followed the so-called new atheist, or maybe you just have been familiar with some of the cliches or the phrases that are sometimes used, but maybe don't even know who some of these people we'll be talking about really are. And so to really help us with this, we go to the author of this book, Justin Brierley, who is a broadcaster in the United Kingdom. He's a UK broadcaster, writer, and speaker. He's hosted The Unbelievable Show, also the Ask NT Write Anything podcast, and currently hosts the Re-Enchanting podcast. Also has a new documentary podcast called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, which is, of course, the title of his book. And you might be familiar with his previous book, Unbelievable, Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. And now this new book coming out, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Justin, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's great to be with you, Kerby. Thanks for having me on.
Well, let's kind of set the scene. For those of you in the UK, Richard Dawkins, obviously very familiar when he was alive. For those in this country, of course, we know those individuals, but we also know Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett. And your first chapter talks about the rise and fall of new atheism. And when that particular kind of new atheist group hit the bestseller list, it seemed like this was going to be the end of Christianity, at least so they thought, because they thought they had some of the most powerful arguments about Christianity, some borrowed from the older atheists and some that are created by the newer individuals, but it just didn't quite turn out that way, did it?
No, it didn't, and I was privileged to have a bit of a front row seat, really, to the new atheism as a movement through the radio show and podcast I hosted for many years called Unbelievable, where we tested, some of the arguments for and against Christianity with some of the best-known expositors and architects of the new atheism. And I was always, it was interesting to see actually how well ultimately thinking intellectually credible Christianity came out, because the arguments themselves weren't actually that great. I mean, in a sense, there weren't really any new arguments. They were just putting it across in a sort of more popular form, often in a very derogatory form as well. Ridicule was one of the key weapons, in a way, used by the new atheism. So it was very much a popular level kind of way of engaging with science, faith, religion, and that kind of thing. But ultimately, as a movement, I think it lost its cultural cachet and ran out of steam probably just sort of 5 to 10 years after it began. And I noticed, as I was hosting these conversations between Christians and non-Christians on my show, that actually more and more people were defining themselves, if they came on as a non-believer, against the new atheism, saying I'm not a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist. So as a movement, it kind of lost some of its sparkle along the way.
Right. And I love how you open it, because you see a bus emblazoned with the words, "There's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life." As you point out, first of all, it probably had the reverse, and that is, if your goal was to make people forget about God, it did just the opposite. And I've always laughed about this, Justin, that, I don't really want to dedicate even a minute of my time trying to disprove Thor or Zeus or something of that nature, because I don't believe there's any reason to do so. And yet, over the years here in the United States, and I know you over in the UK, run into people that have really dedicated their whole lives to trying to prove that God doesn't exist. And you would think if you don't believe God exists, you just go on about your life, which is not exactly how they do that. They sell T-shirts, they sell books, they have lectures. Of course, it makes them some money, but nevertheless, it always has been a little bit troubling to me that a person is working so hard to tell me there's no God, when I think in the back of their mind they maybe know that there is.
Well, yes, it's something about the lady doth protest too much, isn't there, about it? I think there's a sense in which you're right. It does seem odd that so many people, so many atheists, did put so much effort and time into essentially the denial of God. Now, obviously, many of them would have said that they were doing it because they believed religion was a threat to their freedoms and that kind of thing. In the end, though, in all honesty, Kerby, as I looked at the new atheist movement as a spectator, it took on an almost quasi-religious element itself.
Very true.
And the
Yes.
bus advertising campaign you mentioned was almost part of that. In fact, the author Margaret Atwood said, once you put a slogan on the side of a bus, you're either selling a commercial proposition or it's a religion. And I think it did take on a kind of religious fervor almost, because it had its high priests in the form of these new atheist architects, Sam Harris, Dawkins, Dennett, and Hitchens. And it had its holy texts, the God Delusion and the other books that they published. And it had, in a sense, an orthodox creed. You had to be a scientific materialist to be part of that gang. And they swerved, they rounded on anyone who went against that orthodoxy in their gang with unswerving zeal. So, I remember the case of a well-known atheist philosopher called Thomas Nagel, who published a book called Mind and Cosmos.
Oh, yes.
Essentially asking whether there might be some purpose or, sense of meaning in the universe. And he was rounded on by the new atheists. So I think all of that told me actually that very often, even those who claim no religion, there's actually something rather religious about these movements once they gather a head of steam.
Let me just mention that in your previous book, Unbelievable, Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian, you talked about, as you mentioned just a minute ago, that you had kind of a ringside seat to see some of that playing out. And I think it is kind of interesting that you've had Richard Dawkins actually beginning to be disaffected. As you said later on in one of your chapters, you say, I'm an atheist, but I'm not the Richard Dawkins sort. And then he's gotten himself in trouble because because he believes in science and because he believes in common sense, gets himself in trouble for saying, again, close your ears here if this is going to be controversial, that they are actually just men and women, just male and female, and that actually the idea of God actually might be a good idea, even though he rejects it, because it might cause people to act morally, and he doesn't necessarily give us a good answer for what that world would be like if everybody rejected the idea of God. In the second chapter, there's this new conversation on God, and I was struck by the fact that you talk about Peter Boghossian. Now, we've actually talked about him, but we've chatted with people that have known him, interacted with him at Portland State University, wrote a book called A Manual for Creating Atheists. It reminded me very much of a book in the 1980s we did radio programs on. It was called The Atheist Debater's Handbook. It's a handbook to atheists knowing how to debate Christians. But it's been kind of interesting that these individuals, and he's just one of many, who are becoming much more open to the idea of Christianity. And here you have an individual that really, in a sense, got in trouble because he really believed in free speech. And it, I think, illustrates the fact that even some of our liberal friends, even some of our secular friends, are looking at these hardcore leftists and said, these people are crazy, and are finding themselves being attacked by some of those individuals. But we do see a whole new conversation of God, aren't we?
Yes, and really the point of the book is that, in a sense, the new atheism, because it failed to answer people's ultimate questions about meaning, purpose, and identity, I think it really gave the floor to these new thinkers, still secular thinkers, largely people who don't necessarily have Christian faith, but who are a lot more open to the value of Christianity, who recognize the way that Christianity has shaped the West and given us our moral values and so on. And that includes people like Jordan Peterson, who, again, well-known Canadian psychology professor who's made a name for himself, obviously, with some of his stance against progressive left politics and things like that. But what's really interesting about Peterson is that really he rose to fame as a cult figure almost by doing these 3-hour lectures on Genesis and the way that the Bible speaks to people in meaningful ways and through psychology and so on, which, you could hardly have imagined sort of 10 years previous to that when new atheism was riding high. So I think what this points to is the fact that there's an openness, a willingness for people to take Christianity seriously again. And I think people like Peterson have in a funny way, been a gateway drug for many people to Christianity, to actually coming to faith. And ironically, I know people who came to faith through Dawkins as well. But I think it's really interesting that the ground has shifted in that way. You mentioned Peter Boghossian, and I tell the story in the book as well of how he was very much a hard and fast new atheist. He had published a book called A Manual for Creating Atheists, which I had him on my show to debate, back in his new atheist phase. Mm-hmm. But a few years later, when I invited him to come on a live debate as an atheist, he politely declined and said, my attitude has changed tremendously towards Christianity in the last few years, Justin, because I now see Christians more as fellow allies against what he saw as a far more toxic threat, which was, the rise of, these very woke progressive ideologies and so on that he thought were threatening academic freedom. So he saw this as a kind of the rise of quasi-religious beliefs that were actually far more, in his view, dangerous to academic freedom than Christianity was. So the ground has very much changed in the last several years, and I think it's important that Christians understand that so that they know what questions and issues are actually out there and what people are asking.
And again, of course, we're talking about Jordan Peterson, but you also mentioned Douglas Murray, and of all people, Russell Brand. Then when you get into history, Tom Holland, who's been on the program talking about his book Dominion, I find myself sometimes bringing people on that would disagree with most of the things we talk about around this table, but nevertheless can have a cordial conversation with them because they look at the left, the really hardcore left, and they've been attacked unmercifully. And so that, I think, is part of it. But you mentioned something in passing that you do get into as well, and that is the need for meaning. And you talk about the meaning crisis. In your country, of course, you are dealing with people with just high rates of anxiety and depression, suicidal ideation. But we find those in this country, too. Now, I believe the ultimate answer is the gospel. But even when you see what some of these individuals who are not Christians are saying, you need to have some sense of grounding, some common sense, some sense of hope, they're all identifying an issue that I think the church should really be speaking to.
I think you're right. And there's a psychologist called John Vervaeke who coined this phrase, the meaning crisis. And I think it's a helpful one because I think it does speak to the way in which, because we've lost the common story that most people sort of understood their lives through, which is the Christian story, that was a story that gave them a sense of who they were. It gave them a sense of where they were coming from, what life was about now, and what the future held. And whether they explicitly recognized that or not, that sort of being part of a story helped people to make sense of their life. The problem is that in the meaning crisis is essentially a moment in our Western culture where we've sort of jettisoned the Christian story by and large, and we've replaced it with all kinds of other postmodern stories where we're effectively being asked to create our identity from scratch. And I think that's what you see a lot in a lot of the new ideologies and identities that are sort of on offer now for young people especially. But I think that is, for most young people, an intolerable burden. I think it is partly why we're seeing this increase in anxiety and depression and everything else, because, it's not normal. It's not the usual, we're not equipped to deal with the kind of the many options that are on offer and to sort of essentially build our identity from scratch. And so I think a lot of what these new thinkers are saying are they're recognizing that firstly, that new atheism didn't offer any satisfactory answers, but they're also recognizing that the reason that we shouldn't throw Christianity out, because actually it did give people this sense of stability, this sense of who they were. It is responsible for the moral values that are still kind of our basic assumptions about the way life should be lived in the West. And to that extent, I think there is a space for Christians to now begin suggesting to people who are living through this meaning crisis, well, what about going back to the original story? What about giving it a second chance? And for me, that's an exciting moment for the church because perhaps we're getting to the point where people are ready to hear it again.
Well, again, since you talked about moral values, let's get to that. Number one, their meaning, and that's a real challenge. Number two, another M, morality or explaining morality. In your first book, Unbelievable, you spent some time explaining that atheists really don't have a good, solid foundation for believing in objective morality. And even the idea of moral codes and even some people talking about natural law, that's just nothing more than preference. If you reject the idea of God, then you really don't have a basis for saying certain things are right or certain things are wrong, certain things are true and certain things are false. And so not only is there a real frustration with a lack of meaning, but it's almost impossible, if you really follow it to its logical extension, to even be able to make a moral judgment unless you believe in absolute moral standards, and that comes all the way back to the character of God.
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, I laid out that what is sometimes called the moral argument in my first book, because I do think that it's a really difficult one for an atheist who often, are very moral people in many ways. They believe in justice and equality and so on. But it is difficult to ground that on a universe where ultimately everything is reducible to matter in motion. Where do these moral beliefs and virtues and so on actually reside? And what's interesting for me, though, is in a way I took that argument and spelled it out briefly in this new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. But I wanted to point out that it's not just that we don't really have a foundation for moral values on an atheistic worldview. I also wanted to help people understand that the values they do hold are essentially directly a result of the Christian Revolution, and
right.
Something that Tom Holland, who you mentioned earlier, has been very helpful in pointing out, which is that, we didn't arrive at our belief in human rights and justice, equality, freedom, dignity, and so on from some sort of scientific exercise or from some Enlightenment rationalistic principles. They very directly come from the Christian Revolution, the idea that God became human, died the death of a rebel slave, and that through that movement they established this extraordinary thing we call the church, in which people were given back their dignity. It was a movement which supported women and children, that gave slaves their humanity because they weren't allowed to be used as sex objects anymore. It was a revolutionary movement, and it was really Tom Holland, as a secular historian, sort of putting himself into the shoes of those ancient people. He realized, doing that, how different the morality of the pagan world was and just what a difference Christianity made.
Certainly
and he came to the conclusion by himself that he said, even though I'm not a believing Christian, he said, in every other respect, I am a Christian because all the values I hold dear came from Christianity.
And we worked our way through just about half of the book, and I thought we might now focus on rediscovering the Bible. And before we get to kind of the evidence for the Bible, you do have a nice section here about how the new atheists read the Bible, how the new thinkers read the Bible, how psychologists read the Bible, and the rest. But when we come to this whole area of the evidence for our faith and the evidence for the Bible, I'm always struck by the fact that at a time when we have more manuscript evidence we've ever had before, more archaeological evidence than ever before, you have more people rejecting the Bible. At a time when you have more evidence suggesting, as we'll talk about in just a minute, the fine-tuning of the universe and all sorts of really, I think, profound arguments for the existence of God, you have so many people deconstructing their faith. And it isn't because the evidence is not there. It's in some respects they're walking away when we have some of the best evidence we've ever had in the history of the church.
Yeah. I think the reasons for what's sometimes been called deconstruction and so on are more cultural, really,
yes.
than about evidence. And to some extent, that's a separate issue, which, I do cover a little bit in the book towards the end. But I'd agree with you, Kerby, that actually we have a wealth of new understanding and knowledge and evidence when it comes to the Bible. I mean, one of the people I did speak to in one of my conversations about the Bible was Douglas Murray, who, again, is one of these sort of new secular thinkers who describes himself as a Christian atheist, interestingly, because, again, he's one of these non-believers
Interesting
who
man,
recognizes
yes.
that the values and virtues that he believes in essentially come from Christianity. But he sort of lost whatever faith he did have in his early 20s, partly because of doubts over the reliability of the Bible. And I've told Douglas, he really needs to go back and update his scholarship because he was really going on sort of 19th century biblical criticism.
Yes.
And the reality is that the field has moved on enormously, and you've got, so much more evidence now that, new manuscript evidence, so much research done. I love Richard Baucom's research, for instance, in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, where he's just made some fascinating discoveries about the way that the names in the Gospels, through archaeological research, tie perfectly with the times and dates that you would expect to find in that part of the world in that particular time. These aren't accounts that were written down at a later time in a different place, because you can't get those details right unless you were there. They didn't have Google back then. They didn't have records in the way that we have them. You had to be part of that place, part of that culture, to know the names of the people, the names of the places, the types of terminology and that they would use at the time. The Gospels get it all right, and I think too often people have been too quick to judge the Gospels because of an apparent anomaly here or contradiction there, when actually we need to give it the benefit of the doubt, because actually it gets so much right. Probably we're the ones who are misunderstanding or not seeing things when we do, supposedly run across a contradiction. So I've been enormously impressed, actually, by the reliability of the Gospels especially. And I think it's time that, more people knew about that. I wish, for instance, Douglas Murray would avail himself of some of the latest scholarship on that front.
Let's talk about one other individual we've had on the program. That's Jonathan Haidt. We talked with him about the coddling of the American mind. And by the way, his co-author was a Christian. He is, of course, an evolutionary psychologist, probably the best way to describe him. His book, The Righteous Mind, I tend to quote from. I oftentimes quote from The Coddling of the American Mind. But you point out in the book that even as he was researching the other book, The Happiness Hypothesis, he really said, in some respects, he began to see the value of the Bible. So it is intriguing that whether we're talking about the new atheist, the new thinkers, or even the so-called psychologist, if they just give themselves a few minutes to read God's Word, it doesn't necessarily always lead to conversion. It does kind of open their eyes, maybe knock the scales off of their eyes, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think sometimes it's about losing some of the baggage that we all bring sometimes to our understanding of the Bible. Sometimes we do need to have a better and more nuanced sort of understanding of the genres of Scripture and the way that we're supposed to understand it and that kind of thing. But I think what people like Haidt have revealed to us is that there's a lot of what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery that goes on in our world today. This idea that the only things that are worth thinking about or reading are, what was written 5 minutes ago. And what I think Jonathan Haidt points out is that the reason the Bible has been around this long is because people have always, even from a non-Christian perspective, he can say it's because it contains stuff that people felt was worth passing down. It has wisdom in it that has actually helped people in their lives. And I still don't think you can get a better summary of what a meaningful life is than the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. I still don't think you can find a better explanation of, moral codes than what you find essentially in the teachings and life of Jesus. It's never been bettered. It's never been more influential. And for me, I think that says something about the Bible. Again, going back to Douglas Murray, I sort of challenged him in one part of a conversation saying, Douglas, what would it take for you to believe, and he said, I think I'd need to hear a voice, as in a sort of booming voice from God, from the sky or something. And I wrote in the book, well, yeah, sometimes we'd all like to have that sort of a confirmation from God. But actually, I think in Scripture, God has spoken clearly. I think there is a voice in that sense, because when you look at this extraordinary document, which has spoken to generations of people in all parts of the world over, so many millennia, and is itself compiled from different places, times over a span of 3,000 years. And yet it has managed to influence the world like no other book before or since. Well, that, to me, suggests that God's got something to do with it, that there's a voice of God that's speaking actually pretty clearly in that way. So I think it's, the Bible, the reason it's been around so long and will continue to be around so long is because it is the God-breathed book that it claims to be.
Got to focus on science. I've probably run into more young people, maybe because of my science background, that will oftentimes say, well, either I believe in science or I believe in God. Either I believe the Bible or I believe in science, because the two don't come together. And first of all, I try to explain to them that really Christianity led to the rise of modern science. We've got a booklet that we've made available where I just give you the fairly significant list of individuals who in many cases were Christians, or at the broadest sense were at least theists, that I believed that because we have a contingent universe, because God was intelligent, we can use intelligence and the scientific method to really understand the world. And you quote from Rodney Stark. Of course, we've had him on the program when he was alive a number of times talking about the triumph of Christianity. And so you have this situation in which we've always believed that science rested on a Christian foundation. But by the time you got to the end of the 19th century, well, you had Marx and Freud and Darwin and everyone pretty much rejecting that. And that's kind of the rejection of the God hypothesis. Well, when we've had Stephen Meyer on, he says, now we have the return of the God hypothesis. And in your chapter on science, you remind us that if anything, if anybody is at least open to the ideas of science, whether you look at the origin of life, the origin of universe, the design in the cell, it all pretty much points to the existence of a divine creator.
That's right. And what's interesting to me is that as much as the new atheists made this a key part of their case against God, this idea that science has somehow explained away God. I think actually, if you look at the real advances in science over the last several decades, it opens up the God question far more than closes it down, because it really does point beyond itself when you look at the extraordinary nature of our universe, what it took for life to be here in the first place. It doesn't fit very well, in my view, with an atheist account of reality. It seems to fit far better with the idea that there is a divine mind behind this. And it's very interesting because even, again, non-Christian scientists, I often find are edging towards similar conclusions. You know, I have spoken a few times to Paul Davies, for instance, who's a very interesting physicist down in Arizona. He's a Brit, but he's made his life there, and really looking into the origins of the universe, the origins of life, and even as a non-Christian, he still recognizes that there's something deeply mysterious about the universe, about the fact that we're here, and he isn't willing to simply sort of do the Richard Dawkins thing of saying, no, well, we can't believe that there's anything other than just matter in motion. He thinks that there's some kind of life principle at work in the universe.
And I thought, Justin, for a minute, let's, if we can, talk about Chapter 6, Mind, Meaning, and the Materialist. We have, with our atheist and evolutionary friends, the argument that matter is all that there is. There's no spirit. There's no supernatural. Really, there's no mind. You just have a meat computer. Everything is determined. Everything is programmed. And yet my argument that I always make to them is, you say that, but you don't believe that. You're trying to, in many cases, convince me of the truth of your ideas. Well, if my brain is pre-programmed, I wouldn't even be able to understand that because I already are pre-programmed not to believe in you. And, of course, at that point, they get frustrated. And, again, the argument that this brain is a result of an evolutionary process, well, then what value do we have in terms of natural selection for us to understand abstract thoughts, beauty, all sorts of other kinds of concepts which have nothing to do with being able to be the survival of the fittest? And so I think when we come to this area of mind and neurophysiology and the rest, you see a lot of books that are arguing for what might be kind of a materialistic determinism, but I just have not found too many of those individuals living consistently with that worldview.
Yeah, and I find the very same thing because, on the one hand, Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett can write a book claiming that we live in a purely material, purely deterministic universe in which really we had no control over the thoughts we have, the morality we express, and yet only a few pages later be upbraiding us on, the way we should be living our lives, the things, as though there is, in fact, a moral dimension to life, and we do have a choice over the things we say and believe and do. And you can't have it both ways. You can't claim that on the one hand we are completely just one cog in a mindless machine called, a deterministic universe, and at the same time claim that we have the freedom to, change our behavior, take different moral stances on things and so on. So it is a strange thing, and very often I find when I do point it out to atheist materialists, they've never really put those two things together. It's almost never been pointed out to them that there's this radical incompatibility in their worldview. I've had interesting conversations again with people, on Twitter. I had one gentleman who was railing against God and saying, I don't believe in things that I can't see, touch, or smell. and I said, well, according to your Twitter bio, it says I believe in human rights. Well, tell me where they exist. Can you touch, see, or smell them? And the point is, people are willing to sort of say, I don't believe in this, while at the same time believing in immaterial things, in real right and wrong. So yes, I mean, to some extent, the chapter on mind and materialism, and I'm really glad you brought it up, because I have to say this is the only radio interview where anyone's asked me about that chapter. What's fascinating for me about this is that, for me, that deterministic story of reality has really undercut, I think,
yes,
a people's sense of purpose and meaning in our world. And I think we don't realize just quite how much that sort of naturalistic outlook on life has actually led to people in a sort of very subconscious way imbibing this idea that ultimately their lives don't really count, that really there's nothing, there could never have been any other way than the way they are.
And when you brought up the idea of meaning, that was important, because we just, as we just mentioned before, we're talking about high levels of frustration, anxiety, depression, people that are lonely, people are constantly depressed, people are suicidal. And when you believe that the world is predetermined and you live, you die in your dirt, and that's all there is to life, and that everything is predetermined, there's nothing that you can do, and it's all pre-programmed. Why would you want to go on living if indeed that's your view of the world?
Exactly. So it's no surprise to me that we live in this, highly anxious, depressed, nihilistic kind of generation, because that's sort of what they've been told is the actual story of reality. And I just think we need to tell people, look, you've been sold a lie. This is not the story of reality. In fact, it's staring us in the face that we actually do believe in real things like love and truth and beauty, right and wrong, justice and so on. Because we can't live life without a belief in those things. But there's only one way of making sense of those things, and that's if there is a lawgiver, if there is a source of truth and beauty and justice and love and light, And for me, that's, if you want to work out what life is about, go back to the source. If you want to work out whether there's any sense to this story, this play that we're in, go and ask the playwright. They're the one who needs to give you that sense of what it will make sense of. And when Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, I think he's literally saying, I am the source of everything that you find important, everything that actually makes life worth living. You need to come to me. And so for me, it's about simply pointing out to people that they don't have to believe this story they've been sold by the atheist secular world, but actually life makes so much more sense when we believe there really is a source of meaning, purpose, joy, identity, and that has a name, Jesus Christ, in the end.
So good. Last chapter, of course, is on the surprising rebirth of belief in God. We've sort of been talking about that. And, of course, you tell a wonderful story about C.S. Lewis. But in some respects, that's why I think this is a book of hope and a reminder that we don't have to be cowed by the arguments being given by the so-called new atheist or even by your secular skeptical friends. We should have a real confidence in terms of all the things that we've discussed and many more that we didn't have a chance to get into in your book. But just before we let you go for the day, I thought I might just mention, Justin, that we have justinbrierley.com. It's spelled Brierley, but you don't have to remember that because all you need to do is go to our website, pointofview.net, and you will see a link there. And it has information about your new book, your newsletter, contact information, how people can support you. And, of course, I know that you're in the UK, but if you have a trip to the United States, we would love to mention that and even give people some information about that so they could have you come and speak. And most importantly, if people would like to follow you and read more of what you are writing and some of the videos and books and podcasts and other things, all of that's available at the website, isn't it?
That's right, yes, justinbrierley.com, and you can even get signed copies of the book there if you'd like to. So it's available to pre-order now, and it's been a real joy talking to you.
But if nothing else, I just wanted people to know that you are certainly doing such a great job of articulating some of these ideas. I want to encourage as many people to follow the link that we provide to get the book so that will do well for you. It will get some attention on Amazon and other places and then maybe cause other people to buy the book as well. So, Justin, it's been a delight to have you on the program, and I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me on, Kerby. It was great to chat with you.
Well, hope you appreciated the conversation we had here today. And don't forget that if you would like more information about what we're talking about, you can find it at the website pointofview.net. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.